Question 3C is going to ask us to write the method average score. It takes the scores array as a parameter, and that's all the parameters, and then it actually computes and returns the average score. It says, however, if the size of the array scores is 6 or greater, so in other words, if we have at least 6 scores, and the maximum or the minimum only occur once in the array, then that value is excluded from computing the average. So for instance, if you're thinking about this actual competition, if you have one judge who gives a really high score, or a score that is just alone by itself at the top, or a score that's too low, that's lower than any of the other judges scored, those are excluded. And so you're really just focused on the middle ground to determine the average. So then it says, in writing this method, assume that the methods account occurrences from part A and find max and min from part B work as specified, regardless of what you wrote there. You may not receive full credit if instead of calling these methods you write equivalent code. So again, that's just an indicator that we want to use both of those methods somewhere in this code. Alright, and if we think about it, it won't be too difficult to understand like why we need to use those methods and how beneficial they're going to be to us. So the method header is listed as public static double average score, and again it takes in an array of integers called scores. Same array of integers we've been looking at this whole time. So look back at the comment above the method header, just to again quickly recap what the method does. So it returns the average of the value in scores. However, if the size of the array is not less than 6, so if it's 6 or bigger, the largest value occurs only once. If that's true, then that value is excluded from the average. Same for the smallest value. And then we have two preconditions. Remember to check these. So the length of scores, we are given at least 3 scores. So again, we don't have to worry about what is the average if there are no scores, or just 1 or 2 scores, anything like that. We're guaranteed that the length of the list is at least 3, and we're also guaranteed that all the scores are within the acceptable range 0 to 100. So when we are computing an average, how do we find the average of a set of values? What do we do with them? Well, we add all our values up and divide it by how many there are. That's basic math, right? So since I need to keep track of the total here, I need to add all these scores up, probably want some type of variable to add all those values up. And since each one of the scores is an integer, then the sum of all the values is also going to be an integer. I'm going to start off with sum equal to 0, and then when I go through the list, I'll just simply update sum. I'll add each score to get the total sum. Okay. I also need to divide it by how many there are, which, if you think about it, we can get the number of values by simply calling scores.length. However, if we think about what's happening here, there is potential that we have to exclude or not count some of the scores. So we need to know which ones we're not counting or how many we're not counting. Like if we're excluding the maximum score, then we would want to divide our total by 1 less than the count of, or than the length of the array. If we're not counting the minimum, same thing. What if we don't count both? Maybe there's like 30 judges and we don't want to count the highest or the lowest score because neither one of them occurs more than once. So then we would want to actually divide it by 2 fewer than the length of the array. So what I want to do to make this simple is come up with another integer variable. We'll call it num scores, for how many scores we're going to count. And we'll start off setting it equal to the length of the array. So we're going to assume that we're going to count all of them to start with. And then if we come across some scores that we don't want to include, we'll just simply take away 1 from how many we're going to divide by. Okay. So at this point, let's go ahead and go through and add all these up. So to do this, I could use a for loop, either a standard, or since I'm just accessing the values of the scores and using them to increase the sum, I'm not changing anything about the scores. Could use a for each loop here. I think it's a little simpler to use a for each loop. So again, scores holds integers, so we put the type. What we're going to call each score, again I'm going to use s like I have in the last examples, and then the name of the array, which is scores. So for each integer in the array called scores, I'm going to call each score s, and then what do we want to do with each score? Well, I'm going to use each score to figure out how many, or what the total sum is. So every time we come across one, we want to update sum. So we want to take sum and set it equal to its previous self plus s. Just add s to the sum. easiest way to do that is to say sum plus equals s. That means add s to the sum and store the new sum in the same variable, in sum. So do that for all of them. When we reach the end, once we've gone through all the scores, we now have the correct sum of all the values in the list. So really simple process here to, if you ever need to add up a bunch of values in a list, or excuse me, whether it's a list or an array, you can use a for each loop to go through, scan through, and add those values together. All right. Now, to find the average, all I really need to do now is simply divide the sum by the number of scores. All right. However, they gave us that weird condition where we said, okay, if we have at least 6 judges, so greater than or equal to 6 judges, then we have to check and see, is the maximum sort of a score by itself? Is the minimum sort of a score by itself? If they are, if there's only one judge giving those scores, we don't count those. So this only occurs if we have at least 6 judges. So before I calculate the average, I'm going to say if the number of scores we have, the number of judges, is at least 6. So remember, we stored the length of the array in num scores. So I could say if num scores is at least 6, greater than or equal to 6, then I want to go through and check and see, does the maximum occur only once? If it does, we're not going to count it. Does the minimum occur only once? If it does, we're not going to count it. If not, then if they occur more than once, then we don't really care. We're just going to calculate the average just like normal. So what we want to do is we want to scan through and see how many times does the maximum occur, how many times does the minimum occur. And so I need to first figure out what the maximum and minimum are. That's where we use that method. Now remember, the method find max and min, what did it return? It returned an array of integers. So I'm going to make an array to just store those maximum and minimum values that are returned. So I'm going to say integer array, we'll just call it max and min, almost just like we did in the other one. But instead of writing all the code, we're just going to call the method which returns the maximum and minimum. So find max and min returns those two elements in an array. And we're going to store it in this array called max and min. Remember, if you look back, look at your method header, look at the previous methods that you wrote. The method had to take in an array of integers called scores, and we're using the same one here. So give it scores. Okay. Alright. So it's going to take in the array scores, and it's going to find the max and minimum, store those here. So then we want to check and see how many times does the max occur, how many times does the minimum occur. So to figure out how often those appear, I can use the count occurrences method that we wrote in part A. So I could say if, remember this returns, count occurrences returns the count, it returns an integer of how many times. So if I just use this method name, count occurrences, 2 R's, count occurrences, it takes 2 parameters, the array of scores, which is just called scores, and then it takes the target value. Now we want to first check and see how many times does the maximum occur. So where have we stored the maximum value? We've stored it in this array, and remember how the way that the find max and min returns the array gives us the maximum as the position 0 and the minimum at position 1. It's just got 2 elements. So I say go to the array, take the value at position 0, that's where the maximum is, okay, and look through this list and tell me how many times it occurs. So if it occurs only once, so if that number of occurrences is 1, and we know if we're going through the scores, then there is a maximum value, right? You can't not have a maximum value. It's also impossible to not have a minimum value. If you've got a list of scores, there is going to be a maximum and a minimum. So we know it can't be 0, and if it's 2 or bigger, we're not going to do anything. But if it's only happening once, we don't want to include it. So I'm going to say go to the sum, and to represent that we're not going to count it, I just want to take the sum and now subtract that value back out. So take that maximum number out. So max and min go back to position 0. That's where the maximum is stored. Subtract that from the sum. Okay. And then not only do we want to do that, but since we're not counting this, we want to update number of scores. We want to take 1 away from the number of scores. So I'm going to say num scores minus minus. Okay, well, I also could have said minus equals 1, which means take 1 away. All right, either way works. And so now that is correctly checked to see, all right, If it would only happen once, if the maximum score only happened once, we don't want to include it, so we took it away from a sum, and that's one score we're not counting when we go to do our average and division. All right. Let me see if I can slide this up just a little bit here now. Yeah. So what I want to do now is do the identical concept, but check and see if the minimum is only occurring once, because remember, both cases needed to be checked. So I'm going to say call the count occurrences method again, give it the scores to look through, and then tell it what value to look for. The minimum was stored at position 1 in that array we made. And check and see if that only happens once. If the minimum occurs once, do the exact same thing. Take that value away from our sum. We're not counting it. Again, that was stored at position 1. And then also decrease the number of scores that we are counting in our average, since we took one away. Okay? And that's the only thing we want to do. We don't want to update the sum or the number of scores anymore. We only want to check and see how often the maximum and minimum occur, and then make the adjustment if those occurred only once. So that's going to close the if statement. So now, that meant if we had at least 6 scores, it did this sort of conditional check for us. If there weren't, then sum and the number of scores just remained the way they were. So now the last thing I want to do is to find the average and return that value. Okay? Since the average is simply the sum divided by the number of scores, I can do this all in one step. I can say return, and we've got to be really careful here. Let me scroll back up and show you this. Pay really close attention. Always put this, I mentioned making a little note to yourself. What type of value are we supposed to return here? We're supposed to return a double, okay? But what type of values were stored as our scores? They were stored as integers. And when we divide it by how many there were, that value will always be an integer as well. So if I divide an integer by an integer, what type of value do I get in programming? Well, in Java, if you divide an int by an int, you get an int. So it's not going to return a double value. So I need to do a little typecasting here. To do that, I just need to turn either the double, or excuse me, either the sum or the number of scores into a double. I want to do that by simply saying double in parentheses, typecasting sum. So maybe the sum was, I don't know, we had 10 scores, they added up to like 853. So if I say double sum, that now is stored as, that's being looked at as 853.0. Okay, so it turns it into a double. And then I divide that by the number of scores. I only have to make one of them a double. Don't have to make them both. Whoops, don't mean to put minus minus there. So a double divided by an integer will give us a double in return. It will calculate correctly. And so that finds the average and returns it. Okay, it's a little bit longer for that method, a little more in depth, but notice we used both of them. We found the maximum and minimum scores, checked to see how often those occurred using the count occurrences method that was written. And just remember, a lot of the times if you're writing methods in the original parts of your problem, chances are those may come back up in later parts of that question, especially on these type of problems where you have a part A, B, and C, things like that. Okay, so that's the end of the method. Hopefully that made sense to you. If you've got questions, you can put a comment on the video or just make sure to ask me in class or send me an email, and I'd be happy to try and answer any additional questions you have about it. So that's the end of question 3. Now you can move on to question 4.